Let's dive right into this explainer and look at a seriously fascinating mystery sitting right at the intersection of biology, physics, and music. How does one of the most iconic voices in all of jazz history, the legendary Louis Armstrong, manage to completely break the complex math behind modern digital pitch correction?
You know, in modern music production, pitch correction software like Autotune is literally everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It can fix the pitch of almost anyone singing today. And yet, it completely fails. I mean, it basically short circuits when confronted with the signature gravelly human purr of Louis Armstrong. So why exactly does this happen?
I love this quote because it really sets the stakes for what we're talking about. Think of it this way. Attempting to force Armstrong's wild, organic vocal style into a strict mathematical grid results in one of two things. Either the software's algorithms are completely destroyed and fail to function, or the artistic soul and feeling are just stripped right out of the performance.
Section 1. Anatomy of the purr, the biomechanical infrastructure of grit.
To really understand this phenomenon, we've got to zoom right into the throat for a second and look at the biology. In a healthy throat, vocal folds are made up of these soft, flexible layers that vibrate in a highly synchronized, predictable way. But Armstrong spent his early days singing over the extreme blaring urban noise of New Orleans streets, and this caused massive mechanical stress on his vocal tissues. If you look at the biological breakdown, the soft gel-like layer, known as ring space, developed nodules that eventually hardened into fibrotic calluses. These calluses actually prevented his vocal folds from closing completely, which created turbulent, aperiodic airflow instead of a clean, pure tone.
But wait, it actually gets crazier. On top of that heavy scarring, Armstrong heavily recruited his vestibular folds. These are often called the false vocal cords. Normally, they just sit above the true vocal folds and you don't use them for normal singing. But under the immense high pressure of his intense jazz techniques, he brought them right down into the airstream. This essentially created a dual oscillator system in his throat vibrating simultaneously, generating intense subharmonics and producing that famous sandpaper texture we all know.
To really picture the physical toll this takes, think of belting out high notes in a rough voice like clapping your bare hands rapidly and forcefully. Over time, just like your hands would get hot, red, and swollen, his vocal folds suffered chronic trauma and scarring. He literally rebuilt his biology into a completely different kind of instrument.
Section 2. The Physics of Chaos, Translating Biology into Math.
Now, what's really fascinating is how this physical biological damage translates into the strict rules of acoustic physics. Look at the clean, predictable ellipse at the top. That represents how healthy vocal folds move in a smooth period 1 oscillation. But below that, you see Armstrong's asymmetrical, scarred folds creating these wildly complex figure-8 motions in phase space. His folds were colliding irregularly, meaning the resulting waveform completely lacked a consistent repeating pattern.
And when you look at this mapped out on a spectrogram, you can actually visually see the deterministic chaos. The physical system bifurcates abruptly. It shifts from those clean, horizontal harmonic lines straight into segments of completely unpredictable, aperiodic noise. It's just a sudden explosion of acoustic chaos.
So because of this chaos, his voice is utterly saturated with extreme acoustic anomalies. We're talking high jitter, which means massive frequency variation from cycle to cycle, and high shimmer, which is amplitude variation. Combined with those intense subharmonics we talked about, his waveform is so incredibly chaotic that it completely lacks the quasi-periodic structure that digital signal processing software requires to even function.
All right, Section 3, Breaking the Algorithm, the Battle of Pitch Detection. Here's the absolute core of the problem. Pitch correction software is built on some pretty major assumptions. The algorithms expect that clean wave on the left, a clear, predictable harmonic series. But Armstrong's reality on the right is a total tornado of rapid jitter, saturated subharmonics, and thick interharmonic noise. He violates absolutely every single mathematical expectation the software is built upon.
Let's break down exactly how this math fails at the component level. The most common pitch tracking method, called autocorrelation, basically looks for the strongest peak to find the fundamental pitch. But because of Armstrong's false vocal cords, his subharmonics are often actually stronger than the actual note he's trying to sing. So the software gets incredibly confused, causing these massive octave errors, where the pitch just wildly jumps up and down by an entire octave. It totally destroys the musicality and leaves the track completely unusable.
Okay, but let's say just miraculously, the software actually manages to detect the correct pitch. It still has to shift it, right? This is done using something called a phase vocoder.
But shifting pitch requires delicate phase coherence. Because Armstrong's vibration is so deeply aperiodic, trying to shift it destroys the relationship between his actual harmonic tone and all that wonderful chaotic grit. The result? This weirdly thin, metallic, and completely hollow sound.
And don't even get me started on throat modeling. Modern software tries to use throat modeling to shift pitch without making the singer sound like a cartoon chipmunk. This relies on mapping out the formants, which are the resonant frequencies of the throat. But Armstrong sang with uniquely lowered larynx and a super shallow spectral slope. This put really high energy across the entire frequency range. So it is virtually impossible for an algorithm to filter out which parts of his sound are his vocal cords and which parts are his throat. It's a tangled mess for the computer.
Section 4. The Human Triumph. The Artistic Cost of Quantization.
Let's take a step back and look at the philosophical core of this explainer. Digital pitch correction is fundamentally a quantization process. It takes a continuous, fluid human voice and snaps it to the nearest mathematically correct note on a very rigid 12-tone Western grid. But Armstrong's whole jazz tradition relies on these continuous, microtonal blue notes. These are highly intentional, emotional deviations that exist strictly in the spaces between the keys on a piano. Forcing his brilliant sea of micro-fluctuations into a sterile digital grid effectively lobotomizes his entire expressive intent.
So, because these algorithms just completely faceplant, modern audio engineers have to rely on some pretty heroic workarounds when they're dealing with gritty vocals today. We're talking painstaking manual editing, literally hand-dragging individual audio blobs around. They'll use harmonic saturation to boost presence without shifting the pitch, or they'll rely heavily on capturing perfect room acoustics. There are even brand new AI neural networks actively trying to learn how to correct pitch while preserving this incredibly complex timbre.
But maybe digital perfection shouldn't be the goal in the first place. Tony Bennett hit the nail on the head when he pointed out that all great singers learned from Armstrong. They learned how to use their own unique, imperfect physical anatomy to convey deep, authentic feeling over sterile, robotic technique. Armstrong's beautifully scarred, aperiodic voice is literally a resilient marker of biological authenticity. His voice was full of nodules, calluses, and scars, absolutely, but he used every bit of that damage to communicate universal joy. It proves that what a computer might view as a mathematical imperfection is actually a profound triumph of the human spirit.
As we wrap up this explainer and push further into the era of AI-generated music and ubiquitous pitch correction, it leaves us with one final, provocative thought to ponder. Even if a machine eventually figures out the complex physics of vocal grit, will it ever truly understand the soul of a blue note? Will an algorithm ever actually possess the cultural context to know when a so-called mistake is actually the most beautiful part of the entire song?